This presentation will cover part 2 of Chapter 12, the spinal cord and spinal nerves. In this presentation, we will be investigating reflex arc components, stretch reflex, and withdrawal and crossed extensor reflex. Let's begin our adventure by learning the components of a reflex arc. A reflex is a fast automatic response to a stimulus. This means it does not involve conscious thought. Reflexes help maintain homeostasis, like in regulating blood pressure or removing ourselves from painful stimuli. Reflexes are predictable, so they are used to gain information about the health of one's nervous system. A reflex arc is the neural pathway that controls a reflex. It is the basic functional unit of the nervous system that is capable of receiving a stimulus and producing a response. This image shows the 5 reflex arc components and how they work together. The first is a sensory receptor, which detects the stimulus and then generates action potentials. The second reflex arc component is the sensory neuron. It conducts action potentials through the nerve and dorsal or posterior root into the spinal cord. The third reflex arc component is the integration center. The integration center is the area in the CNS that relays impulses from sensory neurons to motor neurons. It can be in the spinal cord or the brain, and it can, but does not have to, include an interneuron. The example in this image shows an integration center that is an interneuron in the spinal cord. The fourth component of the reflex arc is the motor neuron. It conducts impulses from the integration center to the effector. The motor neuron synapses in the central nervous system, exits via the spinal cord's ventral root, and travels through the spinal nerve. The final reflex arc component is the effector. This is the muscle or gland that responds to the motor neuron's stimulation. Reflexes can be organized as somatic or autonomic. In somatic reflexes, the effector is a skeletal muscle. In an autonomic reflex, the effector is smooth or cardiac muscle or a gland. Reflexes can also be categorized as cranial or spinal reflexes. In cranial reflexes, the integration center is in the brain. With spinal reflexes, the integration center is in the spinal cord. Let's now investigate some specific reflexes, beginning with the stretch reflex. The simplest reflex is the stretch reflex. In this reflex, the muscles contract in response to their stretching. This may sound counterintuitive, but this reflex protects muscles and tendons from overstretching. An example of a stretch reflex is the knee jerk reflex. To use the vocabulary we just learned, the knee jerk reflex is a somatic reflex and a spinal reflex. Do you remember what this means? Somatic reflex means it's going to involve skeletal muscle. Spinal reflex means the integration center is in the spinal cord. You are probably familiar with the knee jerk reflex. As seen in this video, when a person is tapped on the patellar tendon, the knee extends without conscious thought or intervention. Let's find out how the stretch reflex works. First, tapping the patellar ligament stretches the tendons and muscles of the quadriceps femoris group. Muscle spindles are the receptors of this reflex. They monitor changes in muscle length and are stimulated when the muscle length changes. Next, the muscle spindle generates action potentials along the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron runs from the muscle spindle through the posterior root of the spinal nerve into the spinal cord. In the knee jerk reflex, the spinal cord is the integration center. The sensory neuron makes an excitatory synapse with and activates a motor neuron in the anterior gray horn. The fourth step is that the motor neuron extends from the spinal cord into the anterior root, into the spinal nerve, and finally into the muscle that it stimulates. Lastly, the action potential from the motor neuron triggers an action potential in the stretched skeletal muscle. The muscle is the effector, and the action potential causes it to contract, extending the knee. Now let's learn about two more reflexes, the withdrawal and the crossed extensor reflex. When we touch a hot stove, it causes a reflex that results in us jerking our hand back away from the heat. This is called the withdrawal or the flexor reflex. We will be using removing the foot away from a nail as an example of the withdrawal reflex. First, a pain receptor, known as a nociceptor, detects painful stimuli. This causes a sensory neuron to conduct action potentials toward the spinal cord. The sensory neuron synapses with excitatory interneurons in the spinal cord. The spinal cord is the integration center. The interneurons then synapse with motor neurons. The excitation of the motor neurons stimulate flexor muscles, which are the effector. Action potentials in the flexor muscle results in the contraction of these muscles, thus removing the limb from the painful stimuli. Associated with the withdrawal reflex is the crossed extensor reflex. The crossed extensor reflex occurs in the opposite lower limb that the withdrawal reflex occurs in. The crossed extensor reflex results in the extension of muscles. This is beneficial and prevents falls by the shifting of body weight to the unaffected limb. The crossed extensor reflex begins with the withdrawal reflex. Sensory neurons conduct action potentials from the pain receptors to the spinal cord. At the spinal cord integration center, the sensory receptors synapse with excitatory interneurons that cause the withdrawal reflex. Collateral axons from the sensory neurons synapse with excitatory interneurons that extend through the white commissure to the opposite side of the spinal cord. At the same time the withdrawal reflex is occurring, these interneurons send action potentials to motor neurons that innervate extensor muscles on the opposite side of the body. When a withdrawal reflex is initiated in one lower limb, the crossed extensor reflex causes extension of the opposite lower limb. Weight is then shifted to the opposite lower leg. What have you learned about reflexes? Pause and write down all that you can remember. In this presentation, we learned the reflex arc components, the stretch reflex, and the withdrawal and crossed extensor reflex.